Irashaimase! Hello and welcome to Fitaurus Kitchen. I'm your host, Chef Fitaurus. It's time once again for Shoot 'em Up Saturday, and on the menu this Saturday we have Armed F, a 1988 arcade title currently available as an arcade archive release. What kind of taste will it have? Let's get cooking and find out. Released by Nichibutsu to arcades in 1988, Formation Armed F, or Armed Formation F, depending on how you look up the title, also went and saw a PC Engine port in 1990. Fast forward to 2016 and it's available as an arcade archive release from Hamster, and now in 2019 we have the Nintendo Switch release. So as we start the game, we're taken to this how to play screen, which is basically just shows you how simple the game is. We can go and fire our beam and also the armor's weapon, or we can reverse our armors and formation. Starting the game, we launch in our ship called the Valgar, and we see that this is a vertical scrolling shoot 'em up. Definitely a classic genre. So the game itself is more of a classic vertical scrolling shoot 'em up with simpler enemy patterns, but the difficulty that you have from these titles, we have quite a large hitbox and sometimes really tight spaces for us to go and move through. So once we pick up certain power-ups, we get our armors. Those are the options we have on either side of the ship, and there are 4 different types of weapons that those armors can have. So the one we currently have is the B, the bomber. We also can get L for the laser, C for crasher, and M for missiles. My favorite out of the 4 would probably be the missiles, as I kind of feel they're the most useful. But unfortunately, the game comes out, the power-ups come out in a very curated way. There are also a couple additional power-ups in addition to the armor. We can get speed up, and there are also the F power-ups, which are actually formation. I initially thought they were firepower, but that was my mistake. So the formation power-up gives you those Fs towards the bottom of the screen. If we go and press our formation button, that will go and launch our armor further in front or behind our ship. Let's go ahead and change over to laser, so we can more effectively deal with enemies in front of or behind us. Unfortunately, each one of those uses up one of the Fs that we've collected, so it's possible that if you use that a little bit too many times, you won't be able to send your armor forward or behind. And it really can help make it through an area to clear out the enemies either further in front of you or further behind. So when we die, the game employs a checkpoint system where we start back at certain checkpoints. And this is one of the things where I have an issue with Armed F in particular. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to employ a checkpoint system, but I feel that their checkpoints aren't very well placed. There are certain situations and certain stages where you'll start at a certain checkpoint, and that checkpoint will be nearly impossible to progress just due to the enemies around you or the lack of power-ups. A good example would be right before the boss in both the second and third stages. Speaking of bosses, though, we are at the boss of the first stage. So in those stages, you'll start with a lack of power-ups that would go and otherwise make the boss fights significantly easier to handle. In the second stage, it would be great to have speed up to fight the boss. And in the third stage, the enemies in the section immediately before the bosses is just so full of enemies, some of which you can't fire if you don't have options, or rather you can't shoot if you don't have options, because you need to fire at them from the back, not the front. It becomes like a real problem to progress. So anyway, in the second stage, we start by moving around these crystal objects, and we'll go and see our missile armor for the first time. Like I said, this is probably the one I like the best, as it does have homing. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention about the armor. So it employs a system where you need to collect the same item you currently have to upgrade. And you can upgrade them from level 1 to level 3. If you pick up a different one, it will retain the same level that you currently have, but you won't power up your weapon. So that's something to keep in mind. So we now have the missile, and they home, and they actually launch, interestingly enough, from the back of your armor. So if you flip them around, then they'll be in front, and that's something you can sometimes use to your advantage. So this stage, in addition to having these like crystalline asteroids, there are also these geysers we're dodging. A really neat little bit of aesthetic touch, I feel. You have to be careful though, because sometimes they can pop out at unexpected times and take you by surprise, or, well, maybe not by surprise, maybe it's just like bad timing on your part, or at least my part. I've definitely died several times due to that. So, there we have it. Armed F served up for your enjoyment. So minus flavors, the biggest minus flavor I can give this is the complaint that I've already talked about, the bad checkpoint design. It just seems like that's really what it comes down to, is it's just a little bit of bad design. Then I also feel that the hitbox, and this is more a product of the time, not so much like a real complaint, but the hitbox for the ship is basically the entire ship, and that's not something that's uncommon from a shoot-'em-up that released in 1988, but given that shoot-'em-ups these days have like pixel-sized hitboxes, it makes it a little bit hard to get used to playing the game. As far as like plus flavors are concerned though, I love the game's color palette and the backgrounds. There's really something neat and special about the choices that they went and made, and just the look of the game, so that's definitely a real plus. And each stage is different and unique with different enemies to fight. Even if there are only a handful of enemies per stage, it's nice to have just a little bit of variety. Alright, so Armed F is a title that I can't really give a solid recommendation to, but if you're looking for that classic arcade shoot 'em up, then this is one that might be worth taking a bit of time to look at. Alright, that'll just about wrap it up for this episode of Shoot 'em Up Saturday. As always, I want to thank you so much for coming out and joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.